In Greek and in English then, books are arranged not so much liturgically, but they're arranged, and they're not arranged chronologically, so it's not a chronological listing, but they're arranged according to their literary chronology, a literary category, genre, and within the literary genre, basically chronologically. So you have the first 5 books, that's the literary category. There is law, prophets, prophetic oracles, poetry. You see, they are literary categories. Now, the last point's very, very important for us as Christians. While all parts are regarded as equally authoritative, because it's the Pharisees that lie behind this, all parts are equally Word of God. The English Old Testament culminates in prophecy because it provides the link with the Old Testament. Can I just explain the basic difference? This is a basic linear listing. In a linear listing, which is the most important?
Normally the first.
It's, in any listing, first is always important. Okay, but in a linear listing, this is important, but this is not the most important. What's the most important is the last. That's in a linear listing. So what this indicates, in a sense, is that the whole of, you have prophetic books, but then the whole of the Bible is unfinished. If you're in with prophecy, it means that you've still got that prophecy to be fulfilled. Okay? And it indicates that the whole of the Bible is basically prophetic. The whole of the Hebrew Bible is prophecy. And it's unfulfilled prophecy. So this listing here leaves a vacant space, if I can put it that way. Do you see the way it goes? It's like going to a play of, say, 3 acts. You have the first 2 acts. And then you say, well, what happened next? Or reading a novel in which the last chapter has been torn out. Or getting a television film in which the last 5 minutes or 10 minutes is removed. Right? So that's the effect of this. But what's the effect of this listing? The concentric listing. Concentric listing?
That's complete.
It's complete. Right? A circle is complete. So worship is what it's all about. And the focus is not on the future, but on worship and its significance. It's complete. It's finished. This is unfinished. This is finished. Quite obviously, the Jews don't want this, to emphasize this, because that opens the door to Jesus. Okay, any questions then on that whole area? We're doing big picture stuff, and I'll be doing another big picture, big ticket item now. Big, started off the Bible as whole, Old Testament, New Testament, Old Testament, and now I want to focus on the first cluster of books in the Old Testament, the 5 books of the Pentateuch. Okay, now the names that are given to these 5 books. In Hebrew, they're just called, in the Hebrew Bible, if I bring the Hebrew Bible here, you'll find out it's just called Ha-Torah, the Torah, the law. Or if it's a bit longer, sometimes they say it's the law of Moses. In effect, it's not the law of Moses. Whose law is it?
Law of Yahweh.
The law of Yahweh. But Moses is the central person here. He is the father of law. He is the authoritative teacher of the law. In the Greek Bible, it's called the Pentateuch. And that's just a neutral term. It's nothing theological. Penta is 5, Pentateuch is scroll. Now, what's a scroll? We have the modern way of making books is like this, with paper. And it comes from the Greeks originally, who invented this with papyrus that they wrote on, and they'd bind them together to form books. But before you had this way of preserving written material, you had a different way of doing it. Do you know what the way it was done? It's a scroll. Do you know the way a scroll works? Can you just explain?
You unroll it and read it and roll it back up.
Righto. You have two handles with pivots, and then you have it rolled. So you unroll the scroll until you get to the place, and you get columns. So you have one handle, and you have one part of the scroll here, and then you have another handle there. And you have the other part of the scroll, and then you have the part you're interested in, and you unwind it, and then you get columns like that. So you roll it like that. Now, can you see if that's going to work? You've got to use very strong material so it doesn't tear apart. Do you know what they used for scrolls? Papyrus would tear. This is impossible with papyrus.
Parchment?
Yeah, parchment or paper? Parchment we usually think of is loose sheets like that. That's parchment.
Whoa.
No, it's leather. It's leather that's been very good leather that's been very carefully prepared, and a flat surface, and so it's leather. It's very strong, and you stitch them together. Panels of leather. So you get a square of leather like that, and then you get the next one like that, and then you have the stitching at the side. You've heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls they found? Okay, if they'd been papyrus, they wouldn't have kept. But because it's good, carefully prepared leather, it's very, very durable. Yes?
How did they find the leather?
With ink.
So they did use it?
They used a kind of ink. Well, not the kind of ink. Yeah, lots of different recipes. Yes, and with a pen, but a quill. You had a bird's feather sharpened, you dip in ink, and you'd write then. And as you know, from Hebrew, English, we write from this side to this side. Hebrew, you always write from. And so, where is the front of the scroll? This is the front. This is the back.
So
Confusing. Now, whereas using paper, we can put the whole of the Bible here, what's going to be the practical problem if you use a scroll?
You can only use one side.
You can only use one side. Good. Number one, you can't do both sides. It's one-sided. Yep.
It's a lot of room to store it.
Sorry?
It would take a lot of room to store it.
It's very inefficient. It takes a lot of room to store, and so the most you could put in is a very limited amount. So in terms of computer, you don't really have many bytes in it. It's millibytes, not megabytes. It's millibytes. And so what determines then, there's something funny. Even though the Pentateuch is an ongoing story, and the whole Pentateuch is one book, why do we have 5 books of the Pentateuch when you have one story?
They have to break it
Because
into.
they have to stop.
What?
They have to break it into bits.
They have to break it into bits for practical reasons. So instead of one Torah, at least initially, you had 5 books of the Torah. However, for synagogue purposes, they used extra strong leather and very, very fine print, so that eventually they tried to get it in one huge scroll, and it was so big that nobody could. Normally, just as we normally hold a book when we read, they'd have special stands so that they could unroll it because it was too heavy to hold up and read.
They have to prepare like the reading for the day, like a day in advance.
No.
It's twisting the knobs.
No, because you bring it out, so you store it. It's very, in the ancient world, anything written is very, very valuable. It's worth its weight in gold. You lock it up in the tabernacle. And you still find, when you go down to the synagogue, in the service, the scroll is not out there in front. It's hidden in the tabernacle, and then it's brought out in procession. And it's put on its stand. And you don't have page.
To unwind it, just like, come on.
Okay, come on, page. Well, you can do it beforehand, because when you wind it up, you don't have to wind this equal amount. You can have it partly ready, just by the winding of it. Yes?
It's funny actually, it's very hard to have any sort of debate with a Jewish person unless you know whereabouts on their, because they don't have pages and they don't have they don't have it split up with verses and chapters.
Yeah,
They don't know where you're talking about most of the time.
Yes. And you see that with Jesus, and you see that with Paul. Jesus doesn't say, in Genesis, he says, in the beginning God said, or in the Psalms it is written, or just it is written. Because even books, when you have that kind of thing, the books are not terribly distinct unless they're separate scrolls. So, for example, when Jesus was given the scroll at the synagogue in Capernaum, it wouldn't have been all the prophets. That's far too big at that stage. He would have been given the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. And he takes it and he opens it to Isaiah 61 verse 1 following. And he preaches on that. Okay? So scrolls. Pentateuch referring to 5 scrolls. Just while we're talking about writing and the whole technology of writing, which is changing now with computers and the whole electronic sphere, and with electronic communication, we don't realise what a long history there is. In the ancient world, before the invention of papyrus, and that comes from Egypt, before papyrus you basically had either leather, or things were carved in stone or metal, or in much of the Middle East, cuneiform tablets were used. Now, cuneiform tablets are clay tablets, and they are roughly as big as your hand. So you hold them in your hand. The classical cuneiform tablet is like that, and you go into any reputable museum and you'll see lots of these cuneiform tablets. And when you write it, the clay is still wet. And what the scholar does is gets a stylus that has this kind of end to it. It's like, and then you can imagine your pen, and it has that kind of shape, and you make indentations then with it to write. Okay, with the stylus. So all the Middle Eastern languages were written in cuneiform script. Cuneiform is triangle, from the triangle at the end of the stylus. Cuneiform script, and it's imposed on clay. And then after you'd finished writing this, you'd proofread it. And then what would happen if you'd done something wrong?
Wet it again.
Well, it's still not dry. You just you rub it out. You could just straighten it out, and you put the correct in. And then once you were decided about it, then what would you do with the cuneiform tablet?
Bake it.
You'd bake it. And one of the advantages of this is that you can write both sides of this, although you've got to be very careful. Usually it's one-sided. So cuneiform tablets. That, by the way, until you produce cheaper papyrus, around about the time of Jesus, was the commonest form of writing. How did I get to that? 5 volumes. So the Greek name for the Pentateuch, from which we get it, is 5 volumes. Can you see? It's nothing theological. This is a theological term. This is purely descriptive. Now, in our English tradition in the West, there have been a number of different ways of referring to it. At the time of the Reformation, it was just commonly given the Jewish name, the Law of Moses. Or, even to the present day, some churches refer to it as the 5 books of Moses. Jesus refers to it collectively as Moses or the law when he wants this. He says Moses says, which means the Pentateuch says. Even if Moses doesn't quote it. So he refers to Moses as this collection of material. Now, however, the modern term that's used most frequently, and I think all the modern translations of the Bible that you'll be using will have the term Pentateuch. 5 volumes, 5 books. Now, what's the structure of this book? These books. And before you go to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you've got to see the big picture. And it's important that you see that this is one story and belongs together. Why is it that the material in these 5 books have been brought together? Why does it begin where it begins? Why does it end where it ends? Well, it tells the foundational story of Israel. The Pentateuch tells us the foundational story of God's creation of Israel as his holy people in 6 stages. So it has to do with the creation of Israel, the nation. Now, the first stage is found in Genesis 1 and 2 and up to Genesis 11, which tells us the story of the primeval history of humanity, the whole human family, God's creation of the world and God's creation of the human family of nations. And what's taught here, what would have been scandalous in the ancient world, is that all human beings are basically not many families, but one family. And they're not created by many gods, but they're created by one God. And Israel is not a nation, a super nation, but is just one nation among many nations in the human family. So it begins with the creation of humanity. And then you have the history of from Genesis 12 onwards, the history of the patriarchs as the founding fathers and mothers of Israel. A Jew is a person who descends from whom? Abraham and Sarah. A Mohammedan is a person who descends from Abraham via Hagar through Ishmael. So it's founding fathers, founding mothers are very important. So the foundational. And that takes us to the end of Genesis. Then the next stage is the book of Genesis ends with the family of Jacob, the descendants of Abraham, in Egypt to escape the drought. And Exodus begins with their enslavement by Pharaoh. And the next stage in the foundational story is God's deliverance of them from Egypt, their exodus from Egypt. That takes us up to Exodus 19. And then comes the centre. Of this, what's the most important part? This. God brings them to Mount Sinai, and at Mount Sinai he makes his covenant with them by giving them the law. And by the giving of the law and the covenant, he makes his side of the covenant, he commits himself to them as their God and gives them access to himself in the divine service, and then he gives them the 10 Commandments and all the other laws that they need to live as his holy people in his holy presence. So the law giving. And then you have the journey from Mount Sinai through the desert to the land of Canaan. By the way, this section here is huge. It goes all the way from Exodus 20 through to the whole of Leviticus to Numbers 10. Huge amount of material. And then finally, they come to the land of Canaan. They don't enter, they stand outside the land. And then the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' farewell speech before they enter the promised land. Now, there's something funny things going on here. Why is it that you have this material? Why does it begin with the creation not of Abraham, but the creation of the world, and then Adam and Eve? Why is it, I'll just ask the questions and we'll have a look at why is it that the centre of the story is God's covenant with them at Mount Sinai? Most importantly, why is it that the story ends before they enter the promised land? Remember that God had promised Abraham that he would give the land that he was living on. I would expect the story to end where? With the entry into the land. But they're outside the land. It's a bit of a funny book. It's unfinished. Can you see the problems there? Why is this? Let's look at the last part first. We don't have time. We'll be dealing with all of these in turn. Starting off with, why does it end before entry into the land? Why does it end there? Can you see? What I would have expected, and scholars have often commented on, you'd expect it not to have a Pentateuch but a hexateuch. And what would you expect the last book of the Pentateuch to be? Joshua. Can you see that's logical? Why doesn't it end there? Well, let me tell you, in the ancient world and even to the present day, the identity of a nation is given by its land. So who are you? What citizens of what country are you? Australia. How do you determine whether a person's Australian or not? Whether you live in this land or don't live in this land. Chinese people live in China. USA citizens live in the USA. British people live in Great Britain. Normally, and even more so in the ancient world, the identity of a nation is given by its land. And then you get culture and language and other things that come into it. But it doesn't matter whether you speak English or not. If you live in Australia, you're Australian. Now, God's establishing a new nation whose identity is not determined by land, but by what? And how? It could be through the land, God's land. It could still be, the identity could be determined by God, and if they lived in God's land, well, it's they're all descendants of Abraham, but not all descendants of Abraham are Jews. Not all descendants of Abraham are God's holy people. Now, what we have here is a foundational story. Now, a foundational story is a story that tells you who you are and why you are the way you are. Now, again and again in Jewish history, you get the question asked, why are you Jews different? Who do you claim to be? Why do you claim to be a holy people? What is it that makes Israel different, holy? Is God?
Children of Abraham.
Number one, they're children of Abraham. We get it through. Apart from this prologue, they're children of Abraham. Secondly, what did God do? He rescued them from Egypt. And then what's the most important event of all? He made his covenant with them at Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, he gave them the divine service. And because they have access to God, they can meet with God, they can share in his holiness, blessing. This is what makes them a special people. This is what makes them different. They don't make themselves different, God makes them different. Right? Now, so the focus is not on land, but on God's covenant with them in Abraham, God's covenant at Sinai, and the divine service. So why is the story cut short by the omission of Joshua, the book of Joshua, with its account of settlement of the land? There's two reasons, and you need to get your head around this. Number one, the land was never fully occupied by the Israelites in the whole of its history. They lived in the land, but there were always other people who were there. And it's so to the present day. It's the problem in Israel at the moment. The Israelites never occupied the land, but they always still had to receive the land sometime in the future. The promise of the land remained unfulfilled. And this points to the fact that I've been trying to make, that Israel's existence as God's people, as God's holy people, didn't depend on their possession of the land. They were the people of God already before they had the land. And when they were in exile in Babylon, they were still the people of God. And when they were scattered by the Romans throughout the world, they were still the people of God. Their existence, their livelihood, their identity didn't depend on living in the land, but rather it depended on their access to Him in the divine service. And it's the same too for us as Christians. What is it that all Christians practically have in common all over the world?
Hopefully they go to church.
Yeah, and that's the basic criteria. We Lutherans speak about church membership, baptized membership and communicant membership. What Christians all over the world have in common is that they are a liturgical community. They worship the same God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. What kind of a community is Islam? It's also a liturgical community. What do all Muslims have in common all over the world? They have the worship of the one God, Allah, according to Muhammad, his prophet. What do Jews have in common all over the world?
Abraham.
They have Abraham and synagogue worship. So their identity is basically liturgical. The Christians, Jews, Mohammedans identity. What is it that makes Israel special is God's covenant with them at Mount Sinai and the divine service that God gives them there. Any questions on that? Okay, now the importance of the Old Testament to finish this unit. The Old Testament is the heart, the core of the the Pentateuch is the heart, the core of the Old Testament. So if you want to understand prophecy, you've got to understand it in the light of the Pentateuch. If you want to understand Psalms, the writings, you've got to understand it in the light of the Pentateuch. It's the heart here. And it gave, and it still gives, God's basis for Israel's ongoing existence as His people. How come the Jews to the present day believe that they are the people of God? And they've done it stubbornly and against enormous persecution. How come they are the people of God? Well, number one, because of God's covenant with Abraham and His foundational promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. So it depends on God's word, God's promises. Secondly, they don't make themselves a holy nation. God makes them a holy nation by His presence with them at the tabernacle and then later the temple. So He makes and keeps them holy. And thirdly, as His holy people, they have access to Him and His blessings by means of the divine service at the tabernacle. Now what made, again and again you get the question asked in the Old Testament, what makes us different to other people? The answer is given, God is the presence of God with us. The access that we have to God at the temple. The access that we have to God's blessings at the temple in Jerusalem. Or earlier than that, the tabernacle. So, the Pentateuch, if I can summarise, tells us the foundational story for Israel. The foundational story which tells them who they are and what God requires of them. It gives them their identity and their mission in life, their mission in human history. This is what makes them unique. This is what helps them to explain who they are. Now, let me see if you've understood what I've said for a very practical question. If this is so, what problem do Jews have at the present day?
The access problem.
Yes, and what's the access problem?
That Jesus is the only way to the Father.
That's Christian terms, just think in Jewish terms. Forget apart, even if Jesus never came, they still, and you need to remember that the only difference between you and a Jew is that you believe Jesus is the Messiah, they believe the Messiah is still to come.
So the problem is that they can't keep the covenant that they're in.
In their terms, that's not their fault, but it's, what's the problem? It's an access problem, you were right, just pin that down. Can you work out what it is? What's the big problem for the Jews at the present day? What?
No temple.
They have no temple. There's no Holy of Holies, there's no atonement, there's no altar, there's no access to God through the divine service. They have synagogue worship, but synagogue is quite different to temple. Why don't they have a temple? They own Jerusalem, for God's sake.
But there's a dome there, though.
It's not the dome isn't the problem, it's what the dome is part of. What's it?
So just going back a bit, why is the synagogue so different to the temple? Doesn't it both symbolise God's presence?
It's not what symbolises, it doesn't do what the temple does. The most important part of the temple is the
Holy of Holies.
The Holy of Holies, and then the altar for burnt offering. There's no altar in any synagogue. There's no sacrifices in any synagogue. There's no atonement for sin. In Christian terms, there's no absolution. And if there's no absolution, there's no gospel. If there's no gospel, then there is no access to God directly. There's no meeting with God. All you have is law. The gospel's gone. The access is gone. Now, why can't they have a temple? Yeah, just to deal with that. Yeah, yes, Stefan.
Did God tell them specifically where to build it?
Yep.
Okay, so he told them specifically where and how to build the temple.
Okay, and where's the only place where they can have a temple?
The domes.
Where the dome of the rock is. There's a rock, there's a place in Jerusalem, the threshing floor of Araunah. We'll read about that, very important foundational story. And what's there now that stops them rebuilding the temple? The Muslim mosque, the Dome of the Rock. This is the place where Mohammedans believe that Muhammad ascended into heaven. And you have the third most important mosque in the Muslim world. You have the one in Mecca, you have the one in Medina, and the one in Jerusalem. If anybody, Jew or Christian, started demolishing the mosque, do you know what would happen? And it would be the end of everything.
Yeah.
Right? So, and that's been the problem since when?
Muhammad 600.
No. What's the problem? Muhammad didn't create the problem. Since the Romans did what? Since the Romans sacked Jerusalem in 70 AD and destroyed the temple. Okay.
They destroyed a building that huge.
The Romans could do anything.
Yeah,
They were good engineers, and once they set their mind to something, nothing ever stopped them.
Have explosives or
Well, even there, they couldn't remove the foundations of the temple, and you can still see them if you go to Jerusalem, where you have the Wailing Wall.
yeah.
There are blocks there that are about almost half the size of this room. Even the Romans gave up trying to remove them, but they levelled everything else. Right, can you see now, what do if I have a look at this here, this still applies for the Jews, 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 but the problem lies here. The covenant at Sinai is still there, but both God's side and the people's side cannot be fulfilled because there is no tabernacle, there is no temple. And so there's a big hole in the spiritual life of Israel. There's no atonement, there's no forgiveness, there's no gospel, which means that after the destruction of Jerusalem, Judaism became a religion not just of law and gospel, but of law. There's your problem.
So,
Yep.
how do Jews not have any certainty of life after death, going to heaven?
They don't.
They don't.
Just like Mohammedans. They can hope for it, and they believe that if they get enough merits and do good enough works, God will have mercy on them. But there is no absolution. There's no forgiveness of sins. There's no certainty of salvation. That is a Christian reality. No other religion has that. Now, for the next period, next week on Wednesday, I'll be looking at Genesis, and I'll be looking at the beginning of Genesis. So please read Genesis 1 and 2, the story of creation, and then we'll be going to the story of the fall.
Do we have to do those questions?
Yes, but I won't check up, and that's for your benefit.